That night started like any other, but by the end, I realized I couldn't go back to how things were. I remember the exact moment it happened. The moonlight filtered through the blinds, casting a pale glow across the room, as I lay there on the couch, trying to relax after another exhausting week. My mind kept racing, thoughts of school, work, and everything in between, but it was always him. Always my best friend, Nate. We'd been close for years, always there for each other. There was a certain comfort in our friendship, one that had seen us through every awkward phase of growing up. Late-night talks, shared laughs over ridiculous inside jokes, and endless hours spent together. But lately, things felt different. I couldn't pinpoint it exactly, but the way he looked at me, the way he laughed a little longer when I cracked a joke, it all seemed heavier somehow. Nate had invited me over for a movie night, one of those impromptu get-togethers where we didn't even know what we were going to watch. It didn't matter. We were fine just being in each other's company. His apartment was small but cozy, the kind of place that felt like home the minute you stepped inside. He threw a blanket over both of us as we settled into the couch, the quiet hum of the television filling the space. The scent of his cologne lingered in the air, familiar and comforting, but that night it felt like it was pulling me in closer than ever before. We were laughing about something silly when Nate shifted closer. Not in a way that made me uncomfortable, but enough that I noticed. His arm brushed mine, and it sent an unexpected jolt through me. I hadn't expected that small touch to make my heart race, and I couldn't help but glance at him, only to find him looking at me with a strange intensity. The world seemed to freeze for just a moment, our eyes locked, and something unspoken passed between us. I didn't know what to make of it. Was it just the movie, or was it something more? Something I didn't want to acknowledge. He was straight. He had been with girls before, and I had always been the supportive friend, never once thinking about crossing that line. But in that moment, as his hand brushed against mine again, I felt something shift. It was subtle, but it was there. And for the first time, I couldn't stop the thoughts racing through my mind. What if things could be different? What if, just for a second, I allowed myself to imagine something more between us? The thought both excited and terrified me. I knew I shouldn't feel this way. I knew this could ruin everything between us. But still, there was this pull I couldn't ignore. The movie continued to play, but the room felt smaller now, the air thicker, as if the space between us had narrowed. And then, without thinking, I did something I never thought I would. I reached out, hesitated, and then gently pulled him closer, cuddling up against him. What happened next was everything I hadn't expected. Nate and I had always been close, but when you've known someone for as long as we had, it's hard to pinpoint the moment when the relationship stops feeling like simple friendship and starts to become something more. We met in high school, thrown together by fate, or maybe just by alphabetical order, during the first day of freshman year. I remember how nervous I was, sitting in the back of the classroom, hoping I wouldn't be the awkward one. Nate, however, was the opposite. He was effortlessly charismatic, the kind of person who instantly fit in with anyone, yet there was always something distinctly genuine about him. We became fast friends, and from that point on, we were inseparable. We bonded over everything from late-night study sessions to random, spontaneous trips to the local diner. No matter how chaotic life got, we always found a way to be there for each other. It wasn't always smooth sailing, of course. We had our disagreements. Some were small, like who should be in charge of ordering pizza, while others were bigger, like when Nate got his first serious girlfriend and I couldn't understand why he was pulling away from me. But even in those moments, we never let our friendship falter. He was there when I struggled with coming out to my family, offering a listening ear and unwavering support. I could tell he didn't fully understand, but that never mattered. His willingness to try and help, to just be there in silence when I didn't have the words to explain what I was feeling, meant more than anything. And when it came to Nate, I couldn't help but admire the way he could make anyone feel comfortable in their own skin. He had this warmth about him, this ability to make people laugh and forget their worries for a while. But even with all of that, I always kept my feelings in check. I had to. He was straight, or at least I thought he was. He never gave any indication that there was anything more between us, and I had learned to read between the lines over the years, to recognize when a friendship stayed just that, platonic. So, I convinced myself that was enough. Our hangouts were filled with the usual laughter, teasing, and moments of vulnerability, and the line between best friends and something more was often blurry. We spent countless nights at each other's places, binge-watching shows or making fun of bad movies. Those were the nights I cherished. I would sit beside him on the couch, our shoulders occasionally brushing, but never too close. He never seemed to mind when I would put my head on his shoulder, though there was always that awkward moment where I'd quickly pull away, as if to say, "No, it's nothing. Just tired." He would chuckle softly, oblivious to the pang of disappointment I felt every time I had to pull back. I thought I had it all figured out. I convinced myself that we were just friends, that nothing more was ever going to happen. But there was always that little part of me deep down that couldn't ignore the way my heart would race whenever our fingers accidentally brushed, or how sometimes when he looked at me, I felt a strange warmth spread through me, like he could see something inside me that no one else could. Nate was like a brother to me, and yet there were moments, subtle, fleeting moments, where I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, there was something more between us. He never said anything about it, and I never asked. It wasn't until that night, when the air between us felt different, that I realized how much of a lie I had been telling myself. That evening, as we sat there on the couch, I noticed how different he seemed. He was quieter than usual, but it wasn't the kind of silence that made things uncomfortable. It was almost like he was waiting for something, unsure of what to do next. I couldn't read him like I normally could, and for the first time, I wondered if maybe he was feeling the same tension I had been burying deep inside me. His arm brushed mine again, this time a little longer, like it wasn't an accident. And I knew, without him saying a word, that things were about to change. But I didn't want to jump to conclusions. Maybe I was just overthinking it. Maybe I had built it up in my head because of all the small moments, the unspoken tension that I couldn't ignore. We didn't speak much after that, but it wasn't uncomfortable. In fact, it felt strangely comfortable. We sat there, shoulder to shoulder, both of us focused on the screen but not really watching. My heart pounded a little louder than usual, and my mind was a whirlwind of questions. What was this? What was I feeling? And more importantly, what was he feeling? When the movie ended, we didn't rush to leave. We just sat there, letting the moment stretch out. I was acutely aware of how close we were, how I could feel the warmth of his body beside mine. For the first time, I didn't want to move away. I wanted to stay in that moment, suspended between friendship and something else. Something I had been avoiding for so long. Nate yawned and stretched, glancing over at me with that familiar smile that always made everything feel better. But this time, something was different about it. Maybe it was the way his eyes lingered on mine for a second too long, or maybe it was the way his lips parted, as if he was about to say something. But he didn't. He just smiled and shifted closer, his hand brushing against mine once again, but this time he didn't pull away. Neither of us did. And in that moment, I felt everything shift. I had no idea what was going to happen next, but I couldn't deny that the air between us had changed. Everything had changed. I could feel it, that subtle shift in the air between us. It wasn't dramatic, but it was there. Something was different. Every time Nate brushed against me, whether by accident or on purpose, I felt a spark I couldn't ignore. The way he lingered a little longer, the way he seemed to be watching me more closely, it was all there, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Maybe it was just me. Maybe it was my own feelings coming to the surface after years of keeping them hidden. But deep down, I knew something had changed. For the next few days, I tried to convince myself that nothing was different. We carried on like we always had. The usual jokes, the casual conversations, the easy banter. But underneath it all, I couldn't stop thinking about that night. The way Nate had looked at me, the way his touch had lingered longer than usual. And the most confusing part was that I couldn't tell if I was imagining it or if he actually felt the same way. The uncertainty gnawed at me. I would catch myself glancing at him when I thought he wasn't looking, trying to figure out if there was something behind those glances. Was it my wishful thinking, or was there a flicker of something more? I couldn't tell. I wasn't sure if I wanted to know the truth. What if I was wrong? What if it was all in my head? One afternoon, we were hanging out at his place, sitting on the couch like we always did, but this time, everything felt off. It wasn't that the conversation was awkward, but there was this underlying tension I couldn't shake. We were talking about something trivial, some movie we had both seen recently, but I couldn't focus on what he was saying. All I could think about was the space between us, how close we were yet how far apart we felt. Nate must have sensed it too, because he paused mid-sentence and looked at me. His eyes locked with mine, and for a split second, everything else seemed to fade away. The room, the noise, everything disappeared. It was just us, and in that moment, I could see the confusion in his eyes. He didn't say anything, but there was something in the way he looked at me that spoke volumes. It was a mixture of curiosity and hesitation, like he was grappling with something inside himself but wasn't sure if he was ready to confront it. I couldn't breathe. My heart was racing, and my mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. What was he thinking? Was he feeling the same way I was? I had no idea, and that uncertainty was driving me crazy. I tried to break the silence, but the words caught in my throat. "You okay?" I finally managed to ask, my voice betraying the anxiety bubbling inside me. He nodded slowly, but his gaze didn't leave mine. "Yeah. Just thinking." There it was again, his voice softer than usual, like he was searching for something to say but didn't know how to put it into words. The pause stretched on longer than I was comfortable with. I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on me, and I knew I had to say something, anything, to break the tension before it consumed us both. But then, almost as if on cue, Nate shifted closer to me, just a little bit. His arm brushed against mine, and this time, he didn't pull away. The contact was brief, but it felt like an eternity. I could feel the heat from his skin, the warmth radiating off him, and my heart skipped a beat. I tried to steady myself, but everything inside me was screaming at me to pull him closer, to close the gap that was growing between us. We didn't speak. Not right away anyway. Instead, we sat there, side by side, our shoulders touching, and for the first time, I didn't want to move away. I wanted to stay in that moment, to let it stretch on forever, to see where it would go. But I couldn't help but wonder if this was just a fleeting moment, something that would pass as quickly as it came. Was he just testing the waters, or was this something more? After what felt like an eternity, Nate finally broke the silence. His voice was barely above a whisper, but it hit me like a punch to the gut. "I've been thinking about us," he said, his words hanging in the air. My breath caught in my throat. My mind raced to make sense of what he was saying. Was this it? Was this the moment where everything changed? I had no idea what to say, so I just stayed silent, waiting for him to continue. He seemed to be struggling, like he was trying to find the right words but couldn't quite make them come out. "I don't know what's going on with me," he admitted, his voice shaky. "I've been feeling weird around you. I don't know, like things are different. And I don't know if I'm overthinking it, or if it's... I don't know." His words hung in the air like a fragile thread, and I could feel my heart beating in my chest, louder than ever. I wanted to say something to tell him how I felt, but the words wouldn't come. How could I put into words what I had been feeling for so long? How could I tell him that, for years, I had been hiding this part of myself, this attraction that I had tried to ignore? Instead, I did the only thing that made sense in that moment. I turned to him, my hand brushing against his arm, and let the silence speak for us. He didn't pull away. His gaze softened, and for the first time, I saw something in his eyes that I had never seen before: vulnerability. It was like he was letting me in, letting me see him in a way that he never had before. "I feel it too," I finally whispered, the words slipping out before I could stop them. "I don't know what this is, but I feel it too." And in that moment, I knew, nothing would ever be the same again. The air between us crackled with tension. I had said it, I had admitted to feeling it too, but now I wasn't sure how to handle what came next. The weight of my confession hung there, like a heavy fog, and for the first time in my life, I felt truly exposed. The floodgates had opened, and I was no longer sure if I wanted to cross that line. The emotions were too raw, too real. Nate shifted beside me. I could feel the heat radiating off his body, the subtle tremor in his breath. I hadn't expected this to be easy. I didn't know what I expected, honestly. But I wasn't prepared for the silence that stretched between us like an unbridgeable chasm. He didn't pull away, but he didn't lean in either. He was caught, just as I was. "Are you sure?" Nate's voice broke through the thick silence, sounding uncertain, yet almost hopeful. I could hear the question in his tone. He was asking for reassurance, as though he wasn't sure whether to trust what had just been said. He was scared. And in that moment, I realized that I was too. "I think so," I managed to say, though the doubt in my voice betrayed my own uncertainty. The truth was, I wasn't entirely sure what I felt. Maybe I had been hiding this for so long, it was hard to distinguish between what I wanted and what I was afraid to face. Nate ran a hand through his hair, avoiding my gaze. "I don't know if I can do this," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. His words felt like a punch to the gut. A part of me had hoped that, by confessing, we could work through whatever was between us, but his hesitation made me feel like a fool for ever thinking it would be that simple. I had imagined this moment in my head 1,000 times, but none of those imagined scenarios had prepared me for the vulnerability I was facing now. The silence stretched on, and I could feel the tension building, suffocating us both. But at the same time, I could feel a part of me pulling away, retreating into my own insecurities. What if he didn't feel the same way? What if I had read everything wrong? "Are you saying you don't want to try?" I finally asked, the words slipping out before I could stop them. I tried to keep my voice steady, but the crack in it was unmistakable. I felt foolish, desperate, and it stung. Nate glanced at me, his eyes filled with confusion, hurt, and something else I couldn't quite place. "I don't know what I want," he admitted, and the rawness of his honesty left me breathless. "I've never thought about us like that. But I don't know. I don't want to lose what we have, you know? I don't want to make things weird." His words struck me deep in my chest. He didn't want to lose me, but he didn't want to lose the easy friendship we had either. The thought of things changing, of us no longer being the same, terrified him. And I couldn't blame him. I felt it too, the fear of what would happen if we crossed that invisible line. "You won't lose me," I said, but even as the words left my lips, I wasn't sure if I believed them. Could I promise him that? Could I guarantee that nothing would change between us? My mind raced, and I felt a lump form in my throat. How could I reassure him when I wasn't sure of my own feelings? The silence stretched again, but this time, it was different. It was heavy with all the things we weren't saying. I wanted to tell him the truth, that I was scared too, that I didn't have all the answers. But all that came out was a nervous laugh, an attempt to break the tension that wasn't working. "I don't know what to do," Nate whispered, running his hands over his face in frustration. "I don't know what to do with this. Whatever it is." His words were like a mirror reflecting my own confusion back at me. I wanted to reach out, to take his hand and tell him that it would be okay, that we could figure this out together. But I didn't know if I was brave enough to face it head-on. I took a deep breath. "Maybe we don't have to figure it out right now," I said, the words feeling oddly comforting, even though I wasn't sure what they meant. Nate nodded slowly, his eyes meeting mine for the first time in what felt like forever. His gaze was softer now, less guarded, but still full of hesitation. "Maybe," he agreed, his voice barely a murmur. The thing was, I wanted him in a way I hadn't wanted anyone in a long time. But more than that, I wanted him to want me too. I didn't want to be the one who was left behind, the one who felt more than the other. It terrified me to think of how this would change everything between us, but I knew there was no going back now. No matter how much I wanted to pretend that nothing had changed, it had. And now, all we could do was face it. There was another moment of stillness. My heart raced, and I could feel my breath quickening as I searched his face for any hint of what he was thinking. Nate seemed to be doing the same thing, as though he was searching for something in my eyes, some sign that this was okay. Slowly, his hand moved closer to mine. It hovered for a second, like he was testing the waters, waiting for me to pull away. But I didn't. I didn't pull away. Instead, I let him take my hand, and the simple act felt like a declaration. It was a silent promise that whatever happened next, we would face it together. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. There was no need. Our hands fit together like they were meant to, like everything that had happened before had led us here. And even though I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, I also knew one thing for certain: we had crossed a line, and there was no turning back. In that silence, something shifted again. It wasn't the sudden rush of clarity I had expected, but it was enough. It was enough to know that, whatever this was between us, we were finally confronting it. And that in itself, was enough for now. I sat there, my hands still entwined with Nate's, both of us lost in the quiet of the moment. The weight of the conversation had not lifted, but something had softened. The tension in the room, thick with uncertainty just moments before, was now more like a thick fog. Disorienting, yes, but not suffocating. We didn't have answers, And maybe that was okay. Maybe, for once, we didn't need to have it all figured out. You know, I said, my voice almost a whisper, I've always thought that once you admit something, especially something like this, it becomes easier. But it doesn't, does it? Nate shook his head, the faintest trace of a smile playing at the corner of his lips. No, he agreed softly. It's not easier. It just becomes more real. His words hit me like a revelation. The reality of what we had admitted to each other was undeniable now. But what did it mean? Where did we go from here? These questions lingered unanswered, floating between us like an unspoken pact. We had cracked open the door to something we couldn't control, and while part of me wanted to slam it shut to shield myself from the unknown, another part, bigger than I cared to admit, wanted to step through. I let out a slow breath, letting the moment stretch. I don't think either of us knows where this is going, I said, turning my gaze away, suddenly feeling exposed. But I'm not sure that's a bad thing. Nate's grip on my hand tightened slightly, a subtle but meaningful gesture. Yeah, he said, it's terrifying, but maybe it's worth it. The honesty in his voice, raw and unfiltered, made my chest tighten. He was scared. I was scared. But there was a certain beauty in the shared vulnerability, in knowing we weren't alone in our uncertainty. This moment between us wasn't defined by answers, but by a willingness to be present with one another, no matter how messy or confusing it was. Do you think we're doing the right thing? Nate asked, his voice low, almost as if the question itself was too heavy to bear out loud. It wasn't a question of whether we should act on our feelings. It was more about whether we should even entertain the idea of something beyond the friendship we had. The possibility of change. I paused, considering it. Could we even return to the way things were? Could things stay the same once the door had been opened to the possibility of more? I don't know, I admitted. But I think, maybe it's more about being true to ourselves than having all the answers. A silence settled over us, not uncomfortable, but laden with unspoken thoughts. He shifted a little, leaning back against the couch, his thumb tracing small circles on the back of my hand. I turned to him, and for the first time since our confession, I saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Understanding. Maybe even acceptance. I think we're okay, Nate said softly, though the words seemed more like a question. He wasn't just speaking to me, it felt like he was speaking to himself, too, finding solace in the quiet agreement between us. We didn't need everything sorted out to be okay. Not in that moment. You think? I asked, my heart feeling like it might spill out of my chest, desperate for him to be sure, even though I wasn't sure myself. I think we'll be okay, Nate repeated, the hint of a smile returning. We just have to take it one step at a time. Right. The simplicity of the answer, the quiet confidence in his voice, settled something inside me. We didn't have to rush. We didn't have to jump into anything without understanding it first. We had already crossed the hardest part, admitting that there was something more than friendship between us. Now we could let it breathe, let it grow at its own pace. But even with that thought, there was a lingering uncertainty. I couldn't help but wonder what would happen if one of us changed our mind. What would we do when the fear of losing what we had, of losing each other, became too overwhelming? Would we let it go, or would we fight for it? I wasn't sure, but I realized something in that moment. I didn't need to have all the answers. The beauty was in the journey, in the moments of uncertainty where we found each other, again and again. Even if this never turned into anything more, even if it remained a memory of a moment where everything had shifted and nothing had truly changed, it would still be enough. Nate's hand slipped from mine for a moment, but only so he could gently tilt my chin upward, meeting my eyes. Let's not think about that right now, he said softly. Let's just see where it goes. I nodded, my heart slowing, feeling more at ease than I had in days. We were moving forward, not with answers, but with a shared sense of purpose, no matter how uncertain it was. And maybe that was enough. The quiet moments stretched on, comfortable now, and neither of us rushed to fill the space with words. We didn't need to say anything more. Sometimes, just being together was enough to know that we were moving in the right direction. Slowly but surely. In the end, I didn't need a concrete answer, nor did Nate. What mattered was the understanding that, for once, we didn't need to define what this was. We simply needed to be here in this moment, with the uncertainty and all the possibilities it brought with it. And that in itself was more than enough.